I am 82 years old, and there is an apology I kept postponing until the day it was no longer possible to give. I used to tell myself that time had a way of stretching out when you needed it to, that people who mattered would always be there when you finally felt ready. I believed that for most of my life. Sounded sensible to me then, almost wise. Now it feels like the quietest kind of foolishness. I was born in 1943, in a small town in Ohio, the kind where the same hardware store stood on Main Street for decades and everyone knew which house baked pies on Saturdays. My father worked at the local mill, and my mother kept a tidy home with white curtains she washed every week, even in winter. I grew up believing that steadiness was the highest virtue. You stayed, you endured, you did what needed to be done, and feelings could be sorted out later, when there was more room for them. Later always seemed like a reliable place. I married young at 21, to a man who was kind in the ways that matter and quiet in the ways that leave you guessing. We bought a modest ranch-style house with a carport and a small backyard where we planted tomatoes every spring. I worked part-time at a department store, folding blouses and ringing up purchases while my children were in school. It was an ordinary American life, the sort that looks plain from the outside but feels full when you are living inside of it. The apology I am talking about has to do with my younger sister, Ellen. She was 3 years behind me, but in many ways she always seemed ahead. Quicker to laugh, quicker to leave, quicker to say what she felt without polishing it first. She moved to California in the late 60s, chasing something she never quite explained. I stayed where I was. I told myself someone needed to remain close to our parents, someone steady, someone dependable. That was how I framed my choices back then. Responsible, reasonable, necessary. The trouble between Ellen and me did not begin with anything large. It was built out of smaller moments, the kind that looked harmless at the time. A missed phone call because dinner was on the stove. A letter answered weeks later because the children had colds and the laundry kept piling up. A visit postponed until after the holidays. And then postponed again because work is busy this season. Each delay felt justifiable, even loving in its own way. I was tending to my home, my husband, my children. I was doing what good women did in those years. Ellen would call from California. Her voice bright but edged with something I could not name then. She would say, "You should come out here one summer. Stay a while." I would laugh softly and say, "Maybe next year when things settle down." She stopped suggesting after a while. I noticed that, but I told myself she understood. In 1987, our mother fell ill. It was not sudden, but it was steady. Doctor visits, hospital rooms with beige curtains, the smell of antiseptic and weak coffee from the vending machines. I was the one who lived nearby, so naturally the responsibility fell to me. I took time off work, drove her to appointments, managed medications, signed forms. Ellen flew in twice that year. Each visit hurried, each goodbye tense in ways neither of us addressed. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, Ellen and I sat in my kitchen. The dishwasher hummed softly, and the house felt too quiet without the children, who were already grown by then. She said, "You don't have to carry all of this alone, you know." I remember bristling at that, though I could not have said exactly why. Perhaps I heard criticism where she meant care. Perhaps I was too tired to hear anything clearly. "I'm not alone," I replied. "This is just what needs to be done." She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You always say that, like there's never any other way to live." I did not answer her. I wiped the counter that was already clean and asked if she wanted more coffee. That was how we handled conflict in my family. By tidying surfaces instead of speaking truths. Felt polite, controlled, respectable. It also left things unsaid that would later grow heavy. Our mother passed away the following spring. The funeral was small, dignified, and orderly, just as she would have wanted. After the service, Ellen and I stood side by side receiving condolences from neighbors who had known us since childhood. We were close enough that our sleeves brushed, but we might as well have been on opposite sides of the country. There were things I meant to say to her that day, about appreciation, about how I may have seemed rigid when I was only frightened of losing control, but the words felt too large for the moment. Funerals have their own scripts, and apologies do not always fit neatly into them. I'll call you next week, I told her when she left for the airport. She nodded and said, okay, next week. Next week came and then another. I thought of calling many times. I even picked up the phone once or twice, only to set it down again because it was late, or because I wasn't sure where to begin. Apologies, when they have been waiting too long, start to feel like complicated projects. You imagine they require the perfect mood, the perfect phrasing, a long stretch of uninterrupted time. Ordinary evenings never seem suitable. Years pass that way. Not in a dramatic rupture, just in a gradual quieting. Holiday cards arrived, then only occasionally. Phone calls became shorter, then rarer. When my grandchildren were born, I mailed photographs with careful notes on the back, hoping they might say what I could not. She responded politely, always politely. I told myself that this was simply how adult siblings lived, separate, busy, loving each other from a distance. It sounded mature when I said it aloud. Inside, though, there was a small, persistent unease, like a drawer that never quite closes all the way. I see now that I was waiting for the right time to apologize, as if such a time arrives on its own. I did not understand that time is something you make, not something you discover waiting for you. The last time Ellen and I spoke at length was in the early 2000s. She sounded tired, though she laughed in the familiar way that used to fill our childhood bedroom. We talked about recipes, about the rising cost of everything, about how strange it felt to be the age our parents once were. Near the end of the call, there was a pause, long enough that I knew one of us should say something real. My chest tightened. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment. Say it now. Instead, I asked about the weather where she lived. She answered, and the conversation drifted back to safer ground. When we hung up, I told myself there would be another call soon, another chance when I felt more prepared, more articulate, more certain of how to explain all the years of small distances. That other chance did not come the way I expected, but that part belongs later. For now, I can only tell you that postponement has a quiet way of becoming a habit, and habits can last long enough to outlive the opportunities they were meant to protect. I did not know that then. I only knew that tomorrow always seemed available, like a blank page I could fill whenever I chose. By the early 2000s, my life had settled into a slower rhythm. My husband had retired from the plant, and our days were marked by small routines that felt comforting in their predictability. We woke early, even without alarms, brewed coffee in the same chipped percolator we'd used for years, and read the morning paper at the kitchen table. The headlines changed, the presidents changed, but the shape of our days stayed much the same. There was a steadiness in that routine that I leaned on more than I realized. I was in my late 50s then, not yet old but no longer young. My children were raising families of their own in neighboring towns, and weekends were often filled with little league games, church potlucks, and birthday parties where I baked cakes shaped like cartoon characters I barely recognized. I told myself I was present for what mattered. I told myself this was what a good life looked like. Showing up, being reliable, keeping things running smoothly for everyone who depended on you. Every so often, though, Ellen would cross my mind in the middle of these ordinary moments. I would see a sister and brother laughing together at the grocery store, or hear a song on the radio we used to sing as teenagers, and something inside me would stir, brief and uncomfortable. I would think I should call her. I should finally say what I've been meaning to say. But then the moment would pass. The cart needed pushing. The cake needed frosting. Someone needed picking up from practice. The practical parts of life always felt more urgent than the emotional ones. It wasn't that I didn't care. It was that caring quietly turned into waiting. Ellen's life, as far as I could tell from our occasional calls and holiday letters, had unfolded very differently from mine. She never married. She worked various jobs. First in a bookstore, later at a community college library in Northern California. She wrote about the redwood trees, the fog that rolled in every evening, the way the air smelled of salt and eucalyptus. Her letters had a reflective tone, thoughtful and observant, as if she spent a lot of time noticing things most people rushed past. Sometimes she would include small questions at the end of those letters. Do you ever think about when we shared a room and stayed up whispering after the lights were out? Or, do you remember the blue dress Mom sewed for your 8th grade graduation? They were gentle questions, not accusatory, but I sensed they carried something underneath. An invitation, maybe, or a reminder that there was a shared past we weren't talking about directly. I always answered politely. I told her about my grandchildren's school projects, about church renovations, about my husband's new hobby of restoring old radios in the garage. I thanked her for remembering those childhood moments, said I remembered them too. What I never wrote was the one sentence that hovered in my mind each time I sealed an envelope. I'm sorry for the distance I helped create between us. That sentence felt too heavy to place casually at the end of a letter about everyday things. It felt like it required its own long conversation, the kind you schedule intentionally, the kind you prepare for. And so I kept postponing it, waiting for a visit or a long phone call or some future moment that felt suitably important. Around that time, email became more common. My grandchildren showed me how to use a simple computer. And eventually Ellen and I began exchanging short electronic messages instead of handwritten letters. They were efficient, quick, and oddly more distant. A few lines typed and sent, sometimes with weeks between them. It was easier to avoid deeper subjects that way. You could always say you were busy, that you'd write more next time. Next time. That phrase followed me through my 60s like a quiet promise. In 2005, my husband had a minor heart scare. It wasn't severe, thank God, but it was enough to make us both aware that time was moving in ways we could no longer ignore. Sitting in the waiting room at the hospital, I remember looking around at other couples our age and realizing how many of us were holding hands a little tighter than before. Mortality was no longer an abstract idea. It was a presence in the room, unspoken but understood. That evening, after we returned home and he fell asleep early from the medication, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was unusually quiet. I thought about Ellen then with a clarity that startled me. I pictured her apartment on the West Coast, the fog outside her window, the way she used to tuck her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The apology rose up in me again, stronger this time. I even opened the laptop, intending to write her a proper message, not just the usual brief update. I stared at the blank screen for a long while. My fingers hovered over the keys. I thought about how to begin. Should I mention our mother? That evening in the kitchen years ago, all the missed visits. The words felt tangled before they were even written. I worried I might sound overly emotional, or that she might read my message at a bad time, or misunderstand what I was trying to say. I told myself it would be better to wait until I could speak to her on the phone, when tone and pauses could carry what plain text could not. So I closed the laptop without writing anything. The next day was full again. Doctor follow-ups, grocery shopping, a grandson's school play in the evening. Life resumed its steady pace, and the urgency I had felt the night before softened into something quieter. Not gone, just less sharp. That is how postponement works. Does not always feel like avoidance. Often it feels like patience, like careful timing, like being thoughtful rather than impulsive. I began to notice that many of my decisions were shaped by the same reasoning. I postponed small pleasures too. Trips I wanted to take, hobbies I thought I might enjoy, even simple lunches with friends that I would schedule sometime soon. Duty came first, then comfort, and feelings were saved for the spaces in between. It was a respectable way to live, admired even. People called me dependable, steady, always there when needed. I wore those descriptions like badges of honor. What I did not see then was that dependability can sometimes become a hiding place. If you are always needed somewhere, you rarely have to face the conversations that scare you. As the years moved on, Ellen's messages became less frequent. Not dramatically so, just gradually. A holiday greeting here, a brief note about a book she was reading there. Each time I received one, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. Relief that the line between us still existed. Unease because I knew I was using that line without strengthening it. In 2008, she wrote that she had taken on more hours at the library and was feeling tired more often. Nothing serious, she added quickly, as if she didn't want to worry me. I read that sentence several times. It would have been a natural opening to call, to ask more, to let concern bridge the gap we had both allowed to widen. Instead, I wrote back with practical suggestions. Drink more water, get enough rest, see a doctor just in case. Sensible advice. Safe advice. I did not say, I miss you, or I'm sorry we've let so much time slip by. Looking back, I can see how reasonable each of my choices appeared in the moment. There was always a task at hand, a family member needing attention, a schedule to maintain. Nothing felt like a dramatic decision to delay an apology forever. It was simply a series of small deferrals, each one easy to justify on its own. Only when lined up across decades do they reveal what they truly were. By the time I entered my 70s, the world had grown quieter around me. My husband passed away after a brief illness, and the house that once felt full began to echo in unfamiliar ways. My children visited often, kind and attentive, but their lives were busy and rightfully so. In those quieter afternoons, when the sun slanted across the living room carpet and there was nothing urgent demanding my attention, the thought of Ellen returned more insistently than before. I would sit in my armchair with the phone beside me, telling myself, call her today. Don't overthink it. Just say hello, then say the rest. Yet even then I hesitated. After so many years, the apologies seemed to have grown larger than the original hurt. I worried that bringing it up would reopen old wounds, that perhaps she had already made peace with the distance and would find my sudden remorse confusing or burdensome. So again, I told myself I'll call tomorrow. I'll choose a day when I feel calmer, clearer, more certain of the right words. Tomorrow continued to arrive, one after another, each one looking very much like the last. It was in my mid-70s that the realization began to take shape, though I did not yet call it that. At the time, it simply felt like a persistent restlessness that visited in the late afternoons. The house would be quiet, the television off, the light outside turning the color it always does before evening, and I would feel an urge to sort through old things, drawers, boxes, albums I had not opened in years. One such afternoon, I pulled out a cardboard box from the hall closet, the one where I had stored letters and photographs after my husband passed. Inside were birthday cards for my children, crayon drawings for my grandchildren, and at the very bottom, a bundle of envelopes tied together with a faded ribbon. Ellen's handwriting was on each one, slanted and familiar, as recognizable to me as my own reflection. I sat on the living room floor and began opening them in no particular order. Some were from the 70s, written on thin paper that had yellowed slightly at the edges. Others were from the 90s, with small details about her work at the library, the people she met, the books she loved. She had a way of describing ordinary days that made them sound meaningful without ever being dramatic. I noticed, reading them all at once, how often she had asked gentle questions about my life, my thoughts, my feelings. Not intrusive questions, just openings. Invitations I had rarely accepted fully. There was one letter in particular that stopped me. It was dated 1988, the year after our mother died. In it, she wrote about how strange it felt to lose the person who had anchored both of us, even though we had lived such different lives. Near the end, she said, I sometimes wonder if we understand each other as adults the way we did as kids. I hope we do, even if we don't always say it out loud. I read that line several times. I could not remember exactly how I had responded back then, but I was almost certain my reply had been practical, brief, and composed. Reading her words decades later, I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. Not a sharp pain, just a steady awareness that she had been reaching toward me in small, careful ways for years, and I had kept meeting her with politeness instead of openness. That afternoon, sitting among those letters, I finally saw the pattern clearly. The apology I thought I was postponing for the right moment had, in truth, been postponed through every moment that might have mattered. There had been dozens of natural openings. After our mother's funeral, during quiet phone calls, in response to those gentle questions in her letters. I had waited for a grand, unmistakable opportunity, not realizing that life rarely presents feelings that way. It offers them quietly, folded into ordinary conversations, and if you do not unfold them then, they remain tucked away. That was the first time I felt the full weight of the delay. Still, even with that clarity, I did not act immediately. Realizations, I have learned, do not always lead to action as quickly as you might expect. Habits built over decades have a certain inertia. They tell you, even in the face of truth, that there is still time to do things properly, thoughtfully, without haste. In 2015, I turned 72. My children organized a small birthday gathering at my house. There were balloons tied to the mailbox, a chocolate cake on the dining table, and more noise than the house had held in years. At some point in the evening, my oldest granddaughter asked me about my childhood. Children sometimes ask questions adults have learned to avoid, simply because they have not yet learned which topics are considered complicated. "Did you have a sister when you were little?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Yes," I said. "I do. Her name is Ellen." "Do you see her a lot?" The room felt suddenly quieter to me, though everyone else kept talking and laughing. I answered honestly, "No, not as much as I should." She nodded in that thoughtful way children have, and went back to her cake. But her question stayed with me long after the guests left, and the house returned to silence. Not as much as I should. The words sounded simple, but they carried an admission I had rarely allowed myself to say out loud. A few months later, I decided I would finally call Ellen and say what had been waiting all those years. I remember choosing the day carefully. It was a Tuesday morning, nothing special about it, which somehow made it feel appropriate. Ordinary days, I reasoned, were where our relationship had always lived. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and dialed the number I had known by heart for decades. It rang longer than usual. When someone finally answered, it was not Ellen's voice but a man's, calm and unfamiliar. He explained that he was a colleague from the library and that Ellen had been on extended medical leave. My heart began to beat faster in a way I had not felt in years. I asked if she was all right. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that prepares you without quite saying why. He told me she had been dealing with a serious illness for some time. He did not use dramatic language, just careful, respectful phrases. I thanked him, wrote down the hospital's name, and hung up the phone with hands that no longer felt steady. I wish I could say I reacted immediately with courage, that I packed a bag that very day and flew to see her. That would make for a neater story, perhaps even a more admirable one. The truth is quieter and less flattering. I spent several days in a state of stunned stillness, trying to absorb what I had heard. I told myself I needed to give her space, that she might be tired, that I should not arrive unannounced and burden her during a difficult time. Each of those thoughts had a surface logic that sounded considerate. Underneath them was fear. Fear that I had waited too long. Fear that the apology, after so many years, would now feel awkward or inadequate. Fear that she might say, gently but firmly, that she had already made peace with things and did not need to revisit the past. It is a strange thing to admit, but sometimes we delay apologies not only because we worry about hurting the other person, but because we are afraid of learning that our apology may no longer change anything. After about a week, I finally called a hospital. This time, I was told she had been discharged and was resting at home. They provided an address. I wrote it down carefully on a piece of paper and placed it next to the phone. I remember looking at that address for a long time, tracing the letters with my finger, as if memorizing them would somehow make the visit easier. "I'll go next month," I told myself. "That will give her time to regain some strength. I'll plan it properly, stay for a few days, and we can talk without rushing." Next month felt responsible, considered, kind even, but life, even in old age, continues to present small interruptions. A grandchild needed help with college applications. A neighbor I'd known for years had surgery and needed meals delivered. Church commitments filled a few weekends. None of these things were unimportant. They were the very fabric of the life I had always valued. And yet, woven together, they quietly pushed that planned visit further and further away on the calendar. Then, one crisp autumn morning, the phone rang. There are certain calls that you recognize before you even answer them. The air feels different. The sound of the ringing seems sharper, more insistent. I picked up, already knowing something inside me had shifted beyond my control. The voice on the other end was gentle and formal. He explained who he was, and then said the words that ended every version of the conversation I had been postponing for more than half a century. Ellen had passed away the night before. I remember thanking him, because that is what politeness demands, even in shock. I remember setting the phone down very carefully, as if it were something fragile that might break if handled roughly. And I remember standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where we had once sat after long hospital days with our mother, realizing with a clarity so sharp it felt almost physical that the apology I had been saving for the right moment now had nowhere left to go. That was the moment of emotional clarity for me. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a quiet, irreversible understanding. There would be no future conversation, no carefully chosen day, no perfect phrasing that could bridge the years between us. The delay had outlived the opportunity. I stood there a long time, not crying at first, just absorbing the stillness of a house that suddenly felt larger and emptier than before. In the days that followed Ellen's passing, I moved through my routines in a quiet, almost mechanical way. I made my bed each morning, washed dishes after meals, watered the small plants by the window that had survived more seasons than I could easily count. From the outside, nothing about my life looked dramatically different. That is one of the strange things about loss when it arrives at this stage of life. The world does not stop. The mail still comes. The neighbors still wave. The grocery store still plays the same soft music in background. Only inside, something settles into a new and permanent shape. I did not travel to California for the funeral. By the time I learned of the arrangements, it had already taken place. A small service, I was told, with a few close colleagues and friends. That detail stayed with me. Colleagues and friends. People who had seen her in the ordinary rhythm of her days, the way I had not for so long. I was grateful she had not been alone, yet I also felt the quiet consequence of my own choices. We do not always notice the roles we surrender until someone else has gently stepped into them. A week later, a package arrived in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, but I recognized the careful handwriting. Inside was a thin folder of papers and a short note from one of her co-workers. She explained that Ellen had kept a few things set aside for me, knowing she might not have the chance to give them personally. The words were simple, respectful, and kind. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the folder slowly, almost reverently. Inside were photocopies of some of the letters I had written to her over the years. Not many, just a handful. I realized then that she must have kept them, the way I had kept hers. There was also a photograph of the two of us as children, sitting on the front steps of our childhood home, our knees dusty, our hair tied back with ribbons that never quite stayed in place. We were leaning slightly toward each other in the picture, not touching, but close enough that it felt natural to do so. At the bottom of the folder was a single sheet of paper in her handwriting. It was not dated. The ink was slightly faded, as if it had been written some time before. The message was brief, and I will not repeat it word for word here, because some things feel too personal to place fully into the open. But the essence of it was this. She knew I had my reasons for living the way I did, and she hoped I knew she never stopped thinking of me as her sister in the fullest sense of that word. There was no accusation in those lines. No listing of grievances, no tally of missed visits or delayed calls. Just a quiet acknowledgement of distance and an equally quiet affirmation that the bond had remained, even without frequent tending. That gentleness, more than anything else, was what finally broke the composure I had maintained for so long. I wept then, not loudly, but steadily, the way rain falls when it has been gathering all day. In the months that followed, I found myself reflecting not only on the apology I never gave, but on the nature of delay itself. I began to see how often I had equated postponement with responsibility. I believed I was being thoughtful, waiting for the right time, the right mood, the right arrangement of circumstances. What I did not understand was that waiting, when it comes to matters of the heart, can quietly become its own decision. Time does not hold space open for us indefinitely. It moves, gently but firmly, carrying opportunities with it unless we reach for them when they are still within arm's length. I do not blame my younger self with harshness. She was doing what she believed was right, caring for family, maintaining stability, honoring duties that were very real and very necessary. Those were not mistakes. They were expressions of love in their own way. But I can now see that love also asks for presence that is emotional, not only practical. It asks for words that feel uncomfortable to say. It asks us to risk awkwardness in order to prevent deeper silence later on. There were lighter moments mixed into those years, of course, and I hold them with gratitude. Ellen and I did laugh together on the occasions we spoke. We shared memories of our parents, of school dances, of the time we tried to bake cookies without a recipe and ended up with something closer to burn crackers. Those memories remain warm. Regret does not erase the good. It simply sits beside it, reminding you of what might have been added if you had been a little braver, a little sooner. Now, at 82, my life has grown very quiet. Most mornings, I sit by the window with my coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. Children climb onto school buses, young couples hurry to work, and older neighbors tend their lawns with the same care my father once showed to ours. I feel a sense of peace more often than I expected, a calm acceptance of a life I have lived in all its ordinary fullness. But there is also a small, permanent space shaped exactly like the conversation Ellen and I never finished. That space is not as sharp as it once was. Time, even after loss, continues to soften the edges of things. What remains is not constant pain, but a steady awareness. A reminder that some opportunities are meant to be taken while they are still simple and unceremonious, before they become weighted by years of silence. If I could speak to her now, I would not give a long, complicated apology. Age has taught me that the simplest words are often the truest. I would say, "I'm sorry I kept thinking we had more time. I'm sorry I mistook steadiness for distance and patience for postponement. I loved you all along, even when I did not say it clearly enough." I do not know exactly how she would have responded. Perhaps with one of her soft laughs, perhaps with a shrug that meant, "It's all right." We were both just living our lives the best we knew how. That imagined response brings me a measure of comfort. Not complete resolution, but something close to it. As I sit here now, aware that my own time is no longer as open-ended as I once believed, I find myself speaking more directly to the people who remain in my life. I tell my children I am proud of them, even when they brush it off with embarrassed smiles. I call old friends more often, not waiting for special occasions. The conversations are sometimes brief, sometimes ordinary, but they are no longer postponed for a more perfect day that may or may not arrive. What cannot be undone stays with me, quietly, yet alongside it is a gentle gratitude for the years we did share, for the childhood that gave us a bond strong enough to endure long silences, and for the understanding that has come, even if it arrived later than I would have chosen. There is a kind of peace in finally seeing your life clearly, without trying to rearrange it into something neater than it truly was. If this meant something to you, I'd like to hear your story. What's something you wish you hadn't delayed? And what decade shaped you the most? You don't have to answer quickly. I understand now that people often need time. I only hope, for your sake, that when the moment to speak finally feels clear, you'll trust it enough not to wait for another.